Bon dia, una altra vegada. Reprenem la jornada. Good morning, Mr. Evelings. Thank you for your presence in this moment to talk about on Lluís Domènech i Muntaner. Suposo que tothom ha pogut, si necessita la traducció simultània, està allà darrere. I el professor Evelings, el qual jo vaig conèixer fa bastants anys, quan encara era un holandès vingut de tant en tant a Barcelona, a mi em va obrir els ulls a un fenomen que et sortiran a la seva lliçó, que és que els moviments arquitectònics, i concretament els moviments de finals del segle XIX, el que coneixem habitualment com Art Nouveau, no eren només moviments de grans personatges o genis que es deia en aquell moment, com el nostre estimat Antoni Gaudí, sinó que eren moviments que eren verdaderes xarxes de connexió entre la pròpia disciplina i interdisciplinars també en relació amb altres disciplines, diguem-ne. I per tant, a mi em va servir per entendre com potser Domènech i Muntaner participava d'aquest context europeu. O sigui, el que tractàvem també en aquest cicle, o tractem, és que superar una mica la visió més local, no més arquitectònica. Els arquitectes són molt pesats perquè només parlem de lo nostre i prou, i intentar eixamplar aquesta visió de Domènech que ja hem fet gràcies als ponents que han intervingut fins ara i que ara ho farem amb la intervenció del professor Evelings. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this year of Lluís Domènech i Muntaner of celebrations for the honor to speak here today. And a particular word of gratitude to you, Lluís, for having me today. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. I want to focus this talk on the multitudes of expressions of European architecture and design around 1900. And I want to show you both familiar and less familiar examples. Let's start here with the next image of architecture across Europe. And a special word of thanks to Taryn McGee, a graduate student at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture of the University of Toronto, who has helped me to prepare this presentation. I want to take you on a virtual trip outside Barcelona and Catalonia to the rest of Europe. And by zooming out, I hope to give you a larger picture of architecture around 1900, a period that was energized by a wish to bid farewell to the 19th century and the optimism that society was embracing a new beginning. An optimism that initially only lasted until the First World War, but was resumed in an even more radical manner in the 1920s and 30s. In art and architecture, this period around 1900 is identified with many different labels: Art Nouveau, Modernismo, Jugendstil, Sécession, Stile Floreale, Liberty, Jugend, Nieuwe Kunst in Dutch, where I'm from, the Netherlands, or National Romanticism. And these are just a few names. There are even more names for these searches for new forms that emerged in the course of the 1890s and mostly disappeared in the early 1910s. And this architecture of the turn of the century covers a wide spectrum, a wider spectrum than just Art Nouveau-like expressions, as is already indicated by this famous row of the block of discord. The architecture of this period includes a variety of explorations of how established historical styles of architecture could be stripped down and reinvented, and how vernaculars and regional folklore and national traditions could be updated and reinterpreted for a new era. My story is about architecture's European context around this moment, which is as much a story about history as it is about historiography, which is something that keeps me busy as a historian, the question of how historical events connect. While Art Nouveau and all other new forms of architecture that emerged around this time were driven by an unusual international exchange among many of the best-known architects and designers, it would be an overestimation to see this international character as the product of the activities of those protagonists alone. Equally important are all, and I'm just showing you a few examples of supporting actors around 1900, often now forgotten figures that have been vital to bring these innovations to fruition as well. Architecture, as we commonly discuss it, architecture as we understand it from history books, is usually determined by a very small number of players. And based on the assumption that there are connections between those exceptions. While this model works for history books, obviously, I'm not convinced that it helps to explain any historical reality. Often, the direct links between the exceptional projects are either absent or it takes an extreme suspension of disbelief to actually discern them. A case in point is the suggested influence of Antoni Gaudí on the work of Hungarian architect Eugen Lechner around 1900. And without naming names, there's at least one historian that tried to trace this connection back to a possible but unproven encounter of a young Eugen Lechner with an early piece of furniture of Gaudí. Lechner spent 4 years in Paris in the 1870s. During the last year of his stay, he may have visited the Universal Exhibition in 1878, where among the many displays and products, one piece was designed by Gaudí, which Lechner may have seen if he indeed visited this exhibition. And if he saw this piece, actually, he may have been interested in it. And that's already rather iffy to construct a story like that, but then how does it help to understand the parallels between Gaudí and the work Lechner produced years later? Similar design by Olb and Scott Rennie Mackintosh, his decision by Olb is influence architecture. The key architecture of this. And Henri Velde worked in Netherlands, Germany, mechanical activities factory as well, and to Belgium. Yet the traditional carries beyond the number of exchanges between people and projects that inhabit architectural history books today. Evidently, there are many comparisons and contrasts possible between projects that can be labeled as history book architecture, and I'm just showing you a few. But these connections do not necessarily originate from specific links between those projects. Instead of trying to establish specific links, I believe that around 1900 there was a vast network of exchange, a network of shared ideas which goes beyond the names of a few very well-known architects and designers. And this network, I believe, is different from what you usually find in history books. This network is mostly invisible, a network of shared ideas and forms of interests and intentions, tectonics and techniques, but also materials, colors, and patterns. And this network of ideas formed is like a mycelium in the soil, which connects exceptional organisms that pop up above the surface. So simply put, in most history books, what you see is above the surface the connections between those plants that are apparently existing in isolation, but I believe that it's this whole substructure of mycelium in the soil that's actually creating the connection. In other words, my position is here that the happy few, the exceptions, are not necessarily central to architecture's historical realities, but rather their offshoots. The usual, so it's more this model than only about the connection between exceptions. So the usual model of architectural histories, even if it's only implicitly, is that exceptions radiate out and influence the mainstream. And my idea is that you could maybe reverse it, that this mainstream, this substructure, this mycelium in the soil is actually what feeds and motivates the growth of new ideas. And it means that for me, it's much more, to understand the period, it's much more about finding what's common, finding what's typical, than finding and looking at the exceptions. So to be able to fully appreciate the exceptionality of the work of Lluís Domènech i Muntaner, it's helpful to put it in a context, not of other exceptions, but as the outgrowth of a European-wide mycelium of architectural culture. This wider context can be sampled in this substratum of architectural culture that has been documented in architectural magazines, which both document and contribute to this architectural culture. So generally speaking, history book architecture is filtered out of the much broader domain of magazine architecture, which in its turn is filtered out of a much larger domain of everything that is built. And to try to understand architecture's history, it's not enough to look at history books. History books are too selective, but the unfiltered reality of the totality of the built environment is too overwhelming and too unwieldy to fully comprehend. And this is the reason why I want to look here today at magazine architecture. So this is the overwhelming, unwieldy reality of the built environment. There are a few buildings that you may recognize, but in many instances it's really hard to say what it is and what you're looking at. It shows this stylistic homogeneity, which I think is very typical for this unique moment in time around 1900. So history books are too selective, but the unfiltered reality is too much. And that is one reason why I think it makes sense to look at magazine architecture. I know I'm biased, I have a background in making magazines, so maybe that's playing a role here as well. But the second reason why I think the magazine culture, magazine architecture is important is because it plays a double role. Magazines not only offer a registration of the built reality, but as the mycelium in the soil of the forest, they actively contribute to it as well. And unlike history books, which are retrospective, magazines reflect realities in a here and now. And by doing that, they are not only filtering the reality, but also actively influencing this reality as well. To make my point, I want to show you images from two international magazines that were both started in 1901 and both in Germany. And this is the first one, Moderne Bauformen, and the second one is Architektur des 20. Jahrhunderts, Architecture of the 20th Century. They are not as focused as, for instance, Ver Sacrum, one of the manifesto-like group efforts around 1900, but rather neutral witnesses of evolving scenes. And particularly in its first year of existence, Moderne Bauformen, published by Julius Hoffmann, was an interesting case in point. Initially, it had this unique approach of showing architecture only in drawings, mostly perspectives, and many of them interiors, and quite a few made by still well-known designers like Henri Sauvage, Charles Voysey, and Eliel Saarinen. They were alternated, those plates of those perspectives, by now famous architects, but they were alternated with plates that look at they look like design samples of building parts, and they were made by less famous designers such as Wilhelm von Tettau, Erich Kleinhempel, and Marcellus Kammerer, who were kind of famous in their own time but are now no longer household names. I think these sample plates tell us that less than a decade into Art Nouveau, its visual and formal language was already pretty well established. And it's likely that the publication of those samples have further helped to spread this new language, which promised to translate the nascent new century into new environments, total environments, including everything from graphic design to urban planning. Later, it became a more conventional magazine, as I will show you in the subsequent images here. Here we reach Eliel Saarinen's work. And then after that, after the first year, with this unique form of those plates as a form of a magazine, they created a more regular one, which I will show you. This is very early work by Bruno Taut. But here, this is what it began to show later on. Projects from around 1900 that were deemed important. And the same is true for the second magazine I want to show you, which is Architektur des 20. Jahrhundert, which I will show more extensively. And I'm apologizing for creating this avalanche of images, but I think it's important to see this wider context. Can we change to the other presentation? This is going to be just automatically so that I don't have to bother about the slides anymore. So this is the second magazine that started in 1901, also in Germany, and published by Ernst Wasmuth, who later would famously publish the early works of Frank Lloyd Wright. The anticipation of the promise of the new century is captured in this magazine started by Ernst Wasmuth, which was published 4 times a year and kept this principle of publishing individual plates. Every issue consisted of 25 plates 4 times a year, published until 1914, meaning that it's a total set of 1,400 images I went through, and I made a kind of cross-section of the images. In the first issue, Cornelius Goerlit, who was editing at that time, opened with noting that the magazine was dedicated to the architecture of the 20th century, which was, of course, already a sign of the anticipation of the future. And Goerlit asked the question, what shall it bring? And what can we expect from its pages? Most of the introduction of Goerlit looked back at the 19th century. Towards the end of the piece, he mentions that in the middle of the 19th century, there's the quote, in the middle of the 19th century, the complaint arose that the century has not made for herself her own distinctive style. A few modest efforts in this direction are rising here and there, but such a great consummation as the formation of a new style cannot be rapid. The 20th century must fulfill the dreams of the 19th. These, still in the fetters of the conventional, dared not express themselves openly as they wished, dared not to be original. End of quote. So Goerlit is saying here that the 20th century had this promise to fulfill what was kind of latently present in the 19th century. What follows in this introduction, after this introductory issue, is a number of articles describing the state of architecture in England, Germany, Austria, and France. And the piece about France is really interesting, written by Georges Bans, who was the most prescient in recognizing already in 1901 the talent of Tony Garnier, and also paying attention to Art Nouveau, without explicitly mentioning it. Even while writing about French architecture, he recognized it as an international phenomenon in France, Belgium, and Germany. And Bans described it as Art Nouveau as, and again a quote, endeavors to bring again into fashion a national architecture. So here he's adding another layer. It's not only the new time, but also something national. The reason why Bans did not call it Art Nouveau is revealed in the last paragraph of his article in this first issue of this magazine, where he again presciently notes that the name, like new art, Art Nouveau, is not required because what's coming is architecture that shall be simple, economical, hygienic, and rational, suitable to the taste and requirements of the time. End of quote. Which he saw as a great step forward to be taken in architectural progress that will be the formation of a new style. The architecture of the journal presented predominantly architecture from Central and Northwestern Europe. Most of the works, particularly in the later years of its existence, comes from Germany, and many of its neighbors are represented as well. It also contains projects from England and a few from the US and Italy and Finland and Sweden, but Spain is completely absent. The selection contains relatively few well-known names, and many famous names that we know today are present with works that are not considered their key buildings. Yet, what the plates show is architectural mood. It reflects an architectural mood in the first years of the century. Leafing through the portfolios and looking at the total of 1,400 projects from the mid-1890s until the early 1910s, there's a clear general tone, a mood, an atmosphere, which is pertaining to what Bans called in this first issue the taste and requirements of the time. Despite the divergent approaches to architecture, there are striking tonal similarities, which makes it a great source, is basically that many of the famous architects are absent, with the exception of some of Berlage's works, some of Eugen Lechner's, one by Victor Horta, but there's no Otto Wagner, no Joseph Olbrich, no Charlie Rennie Mackintosh, no Antoni Gaudi or Luis Domènech y Muntaner. While the absence of the last two can be understood as a consequence of the total absence of Southern Europe, with the exception of Italy, the absence of well-known architects from Central Europe and Northwestern Europe is an editorial choice. Looking at the unifying elements of this architecture reminded me of the Berlage study of my professor at the University of Amsterdam, the late Manfred Bock, who has highlighted the importance of one text of Berlage in particular from 1893 called Architecture and Impressionism. The title references, obviously, the prevailing movement in painting, which is relevant on multiple levels. Impressionists want to receive actions. Clearly, it would do token depth to us in flux. The idea that art in societies the understanding architecture broadly in 1400 we looked art and being published. Obviously, they are all different from each other. There are some strikingarities. They are all recognizable as European architecture from the final years of the 19th century and the first of the 20th century. Almost none of them made it into history books, not even those focusing on Art Nouveau. There are multiple lenses through which the architecture around 1900 is studied. Most often, in history books, it's seen through the lens of what came as architect would determine the 1920s and decades. This perspective is, for instance, present in Leonardo Benevolo's chapter Art Nouveau in his History of Modern Architecture, which was originally published in 1960 and which remains an excellent work. In his discussion of Art Nouveau, Benevolo paid quite a bit of attention to Adolf Loos, which seems odd from our current perspective, and it's never since then been included in histories of Art Nouveau. But it's hinting at the pivotal role of Adolf Loos in creating an architecture without ornament that emerged around 1920, and that seems completely anathema to anything that Art Nouveau architects were interested in. Benevolo claims, and that's also interesting, ex abrupto, as he calls it, Belgium, out of nothing, in the work of Victor Horta. And Benevolo considered him as the initiator of architecture's first avant-garde, making Art Nouveau an overture to the rest of the century. In 1959, a year earlier than Benevolo, Henry Russell Hitchcock had published Architecture, 19th and 20th Century, which gives Horta a similar position. Hitchcock spends 2 chapters Art Nouveau. One is about Horta, beginning, and the second about Mackintosh and Gaudí, to elaborate the rapid spread of this new style over Europe, even beyond. Hitchcock underlines the importance of Art Nouveau magazines in this swift of this new back at Hitchcock's observation. Similar thing we saw seems to have formed news of 1958 that architects boundary line between movement quote point 4 again the Art Nouveau. And Benevolo, Hitchcock, and Pevsner each discuss Gaudí, but not even mention Domenech y Montaner. This changes in 1976. In 1976, Manfredo Tafuri and Francesco Delco published their book called Modern Architecture. They came to a completely different assessment of Art Nouveau, using a similar before and after thinking in their introduction, where they present Art Nouveau as a prologue, if only negatively, a prologue to everything. Their claim is that Art Nouveau was not a new beginning, but the final stage of the 19th century. And I'm quoting them from the introduction. The Art Nouveau movement was not a new beginning. The Art Nouveau movement, in all the many guises and aspects it assumed in Europe, may well be thought of as the ultimate great effort of the culture of the upper middle class to mark off an area all its own, with a common language, presumed to apply to every situation in class, end of quote. After a long rant about what's wrong with Art Nouveau, they end the introduction with a verdict that says, what's celebrated in Art Nouveau, and again a quote, was much more the exhaustion of a world than the advent of new horizons. Despite this negative assessment of Art Nouveau, their book contained a chapter called The Architecture of Northern Romanticism and Catalan Modernism, which opens with Berlage, Saarinen, and Curiel and Moser. Curiel and Moser, who are almost always absent in histories, by the way. We've seen a few of their works passing by here. Architects were frequently published in Wasmund's Architektur des 20. Jahrhunderts, but may have otherwise escaped attention. They admit, Tafuri and Delco, that it's a rather crude way to group all these architects together as Northern Romanticists, but at least they claim that their works differ from, and now they're getting really critical, differs from the rarefied private emotions of Guimard and Olbrich, putting them really at the lowest rung of the ladder. Also, Tafuri and Delco consider Catalan Modernismo as similar to Northern Romanticism, but they argue that it was motivated. They say it's a stretch to see it as similar, but they argue that it was motivated by comparable motivations to find, and that's again, quote, something identifiable as national architecture. Remarkably, the first image in the part of the chapter devoted to Catalan architecture in this book is the interior of the Palace of Catalan Music, and the second is a very blurry one taken from down the street of this particular place. Even if they remain critical, they consider Northern Romanticism and Catalan modernism as more important than what they call, and again in this extremely negative language, the private and crepuscular dream of Art Nouveau. Because instead, these movements offered something more, namely the images of an arduous process of constructing a new world. But image it was, and image it remained. That's their quote, nostalgically suspended between past and present. The real innovatory processes were scarcely touching European architectural thinking. Interestingly enough, in 1960, Benevolo brought up that he found it difficult to assess Art Nouveau because it was in many respects too recent, only about half a century old. If anything, now that we have the distance of more than a century from the period around 1900, it seems that historians begin to find a more balanced view. This started perhaps already in the 1990s with Jeremy Howard's study of Art Nouveau in Europe from 1996. And this book deserves a special mention. I think it's perhaps the first hint in this direction with his attention for, among others, places like Latvia, Russia, and Spain. And more recently, there is the book that Jean-Louis Cohen published in 2011, The Future of Architecture Since 1890. Cohen devotes a chapter to the period around 1900 under the title The Search for Modern Form. And this obviously echoes what I've been telling you already, how people like the publisher Wasmuth was trying to frame the beginning of this new century as a search for a new form. Like the rest of Cohen's book, it is richly illustrated, not only with the work of the usual candidates, such as Horta, Guimard, and Mackintosh, but also with lesser-known projects and figures, including Josef Plečnik, Sachtler House, Lechner's Museum of Decorative Arts, Peter Behrens' own house in Darmstadt, and Eugène Binet's entrance pavilion for the Expo in 1900, plus also Giuseppe Sommaruga's Palazzo Castiglione in Milan, projects that you may remember from the 6 seconds that you could look at the slides, that were all part of this Wasmuth collection that I've used for this presentation. The chapter's final image is Domènec i Muntaner's Palace of Catalan Music, an indication in the book of Cohen, which is, I think, an indication of the growing recognition of the importance of the work of this Catalan master that we are celebrating here today. More than any other moment, the architecture of the period around 1900 has been subjected to the question whether it was looking forward or backward. This started already with Gurlitt in 1901, discussing architecture's promise of the new century, while spending most of his piece on discussing the preceding 100 years. With a negative prologue, this concept of Tafuri and Daucaux, they tried to have it both ways, whereas most other historians seem to focus on the significance and value of this period's architecture for what comes after it. No one works with the idea, as an architect, that they want to be a precursor of something that comes next. So it's never a meaningful criterion to look at any work at all. The appreciation for Art Nouveau and all the new forms and expressions that emerged around 1900 has been hampered by this fallacy that it's seen as a precursor of something in the light of what came after it, the new praised for its innovation and condemned for its decorative tendencies. Even if the chapter of Cohen ends with the prospect of how the search for modern form around 1900 would continue to play out in the 1920s, his assessment is mostly an evaluation of the architecture of the turn of the century as is, neither as the conclusion of the 19th century, nor as the anticipation of the 20th. I hope to have shown you that to fully appreciate the period and its multitude of engagements and entanglements, it is meaningful to look beyond the evident highlights like the Palace of Catalan Music and this St. Paul Hospital, and to appreciate the riches and diversity of this particular moment in time, neither as a beginning nor as an end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bé, en la intervenció del professor Liebelings ha quedat molt clar aquesta multidisciplinarietat arquitectònica a l'Europa del canvi de segle i és evident que hi ha factors molt diferents en cada país, promoguts també pels canvis polítics, pels canvis socials, i per tant és molt difícil establir una relació entre aquestes arquitectures, però més enllà de la part decorativa, potser ens faltaria una mica més estudiar a fons les tipologies, com aquestes arquitectures desenvolupen un programa. Hi ha casos bastant clars, per exemple, els edificis de Berlage, la Borsa d'Amsterdam, respecte a possibles connexions amb Domènech i Montaner, o la Maison du Peuple de Víctor Horta respecte a certs aspectes del Palau de la Música. Però hi ha un aspecte que a mi se'm va despertar llegint un llibre que per mi va ser molt important, que va ser el llibre que s'anomenava Changing Ideals of Architecture, del professor Collins, Peter Collins, que, diguem-ne, analitza les coses amb una base diferent, és a dir, dona tantes plataformes diferents d'idees arquitectòniques que qualsevol arquitectura del canvi de segle pot ser interpretada, situada, analitzada amb aquests paràmetres més ideològics, diguem-ne, no? Des del disseny industrial, des del progressisme ideològic, des de l'eclecticisme. I tot això són matèries que en aquest llibre van seguint més o menys un relat cronològic, però ajuden molt a relacionar arquitectures que coneixem, siguin més conegudes, de Víctor Horta o de Plečnik o de Mackintosh, etc., i que en canvi passen per sobre de similituds formals i en canvi entren més en el contingut de la pròpia arquitectura.
I think this, let's say, additional layer of reading which you could have. You want to have the no? Okay. Additional reading, additional layer. I think typologies is definitely an aspect, and I sense that it is related to this unique moment in European societies when a middle class, a bourgeois part of society became extremely important as the client of architecture. And this expanded the field of activities of many architects, and it included buildings with a highly symbolic value, like all the theaters you saw in my presentation, for instance, but also the new forms of urban housing, which didn't exist in that form before. So it was a trigger for, societal changes were a trigger for new typologies. And it's interesting in that respect that people like Berlage, but also this Gurlitt, were discussing the stylistic reflection of society. But maybe what you're suggesting, which I think is extremely interesting, is that it's actually not the stylistic layer, superficial layer, but the kind of fundamental changes related to, for instance, typologies indeed, and methods of construction.
Molt bé. Ara ja és una hora bastant que havíem previst com a final d'aquesta intervenció. Moltes gràcies al professor Ibelings i també tinc que agrair l'ajuda que ens ha prestat no sols l'hospital, que ja ho vaig dir ahir i repeteixo en quant a recolzament institucional del lloc, de la infraestructura logística, sinó també de l'Hotel Fuster, que hi ha aquí el seu director, que ens ha possibilitat el sojorn del professor Ibelings a Barcelona. Moltes gràcies.